Okay, so let's begin. Last class we looked at, for the second class, at book 1 of Paradise Lost, and I want to make a few concluding remarks on that before looking at book 2, and to some degree summarize what was said before about Milton's epic claim and the Christian epic claim in the Constitution of Hell, etc. But I remembered that I had forgot to mention the fact that the Civil War, the English Civil War that broke out, it broke out actually while Milton was in Italy. And the war itself was largely a battle of style, a war over conflicting styles as much as anything. There were war without real enemies. So, and to some degree, it fits in wonderfully with Milton's notion of Christian liberty, whereby good and evil are determined by one's allegiance to God. So it's possible for people to be on either side of the Civil War. And what really matters to Milton in that is that the party that is allied to God is the party that will ultimately be victorious. Now, the royalists in those civil wars were defeated twice. And in the end, a republic was founded. That wasn't the intent at first, though. It was simply to get the king to recall Parliament and to restore really the rights that were guaranteed to the aristocrats in Magna Carta, and to stop with the popish circumstances surrounding his court and his flirting with Catholic religion and so forth. So stop doing that and stop imposing it on the English people. But there's no real, it's not like a foreign power. These are battles in-house within the country. And it's not that there's no substance to the wars, and there are no enemies per se, but really it's a civil war. These are fellow Englishmen. It's not like fighting a foreign power. And there are genuine disagreements there, but to some degree, the ultimate issue that started the war and persisted throughout was where the two parties stood in relation to God. And the king, according to the Republicans, had turned his back on God and thereby lost his own legitimacy in the process. So it's not that they denied that the king had a legitimacy, but when he himself rejected God's sovereignty rule over him and his accountability to God, he could no longer claim the divine right of kings. And various arguments were brought to bear on the subject, including matters like the coronation of Saul and so forth. He was also deposed, and treatises that had been floating around in England since the time of Thomas A. Becket, so namely John of Salisbury's work Polycraticus, which justified regicide if a king became a tyrant, and the definition of the tyranny was that he opposed God and his church. Then it justified tyrannicide. It was no longer regicide, it was tyrannicide, because the king became a tyrant the moment the king no longer considered himself or acted in accordance with his accountability to God. So he regarded himself as a king rather than a steward to some degree. It's not to deny the legitimacy of the monarch per se, but when they regard the power as their own right and with no accountability to anyone, neither to God nor to the people that they served, at that point, tyrannicide is permissible by Christians. Now, I've had to do some heavy lifting there because Romans 13, 1-7 says that we are to submit ourselves to those in authority. lots of discussions about this, political discussions, theological discussions in this era. So it's a very ripe era for all of those sorts of things. But Milton saw, and with his understanding of Christian liberty, that really ultimately liberty was entirely dependent on freedom of conscience, and that and freedom of conscience was only possible if one was allied to God. Otherwise, you were captive to sin, and you were doing the devil's bidding, and there was no freedom in hell. There was only duplicity, lies, and corruption. So it's not just it's not the freedom of the one side versus the freedom of the other. One side has freedom, the other has none. It allows for no dissent. And we've seen Satan's speeches in Book 1 are really the epitome of egotism. The narcissist is well represented in the figure of Satan. It's full of self-praise, deceit, subversion, all operating under the banner of, or according to the tune of military rhetoric. So we're going to go back, and we're not going to give up the fight. So that the tune of a military revolt is there, but note that he immediately, having said that, well, now we have the knowledge that we didn't have before, because we couldn't have possibly known that omnipotence meant we were going to lose a battle, but now we know, so with that knowledge we can go back and get God the second time. That's what he says. The reader is not supposed to take Satan seriously. If you take him seriously, you're much deceived. There's an element of comedy in Satan's proclamation. We're supposed to be laughing at the devil. I think the Romantics missed this. There's a grandeur to the speeches, but it's a false grandeur. It's a vain glory. And actually that is Milton's intent. He is trying to demonstrate the vainglorious pretensions to greatness whenever that invariably come about when somebody opposes God. So even though he speaks without irony, the reader understands a heavy irony to all of Satan's proclamations. So heroic speeches, rhetorical flourishes, undercut by the idea that what he's saying is totally absurd and impossible. And the reader understands that, or ought to understand that. So again, when the Romantics say that, as Blake said, that the reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of God and his angels, and with freedom when he wrote of the devils, is because he was of the devil's party without knowing it. I don't actually agree. I don't even agree with the reading. I think it's a bad reading. The devil's speeches are grand, but at the same time, they're constantly undercut by the absurdity of what he's undertaking. So the epic is simultaneously a mock epic in that sense. Now, it's not literally a mock epic. If you look up mock epic, and we did it in first year, you'll see Alexander Pope, the rape of the Loch, and the Dunciad, and so forth, where it's clearly meant to be a joke. Satan is very serious about what he says. We're not to take him seriously. That's the point. His claim to be able to threaten God is ridiculous. What did you not understand about the word omnipotent? Like, we're going to go and beat him this time, and this time we'll do it by. We may not be able to do it by force of arms. We've already proved that can't be. But this time we'll do it by fraud. Well, how are you going to deceive the omniscient? It's equally absurd. So yes, there's a grandeur there, at least the appearance of grandeur, the vehicle of grandeur is there in the rhetoric, but the content undercuts itself constantly. It's not the only thing that's unclear, at least in the speeches at this point, is whether Satan believes his own rhetoric. And there are reasons to think, and we'll see this when we come to Book 4, that he doesn't. when he sees Adam and Eve in paradise, there's an aside in which he confesses that God did not deserve his rebellion and that he wishes things could be other than they were, but he has no choice. And that's an interesting revelation in itself. By opposing God, you lose your freedom to act. You become his drudges. So for all of Satan's claims to oppose God, he is actually serving God. He has no choice in the matter. He's decided that he is going to become the anti-God, which is impossible. But again, and some can take Satan's speeches too literally and think that he really is. There's an infernal trinity literally on par with one another. There's God, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit on the one hand, and then we have Satan, sin, and death, the infernal trinity on the other, and they're equal opposite forces fighting against one another. If you read it that way, you've not understood the ironic way in which the text is to be, it must be read. But that's partly because the theology underlying it is probably our biggest obstacle. Satan here is no longer a free agent, or he is free only insofar as God allows him to raise his horrid head from the fiery lake and do something. Now, he then chooses to do the very thing that God allows him to do and anticipates he's going to do, and furthermore anticipates that he's going to succeed in doing, namely to pervert mankind. And that creates then our theological dilemma. Why would a good God allow this? Which he then addresses in Book 3, but we'll get to that when we get to it. But that's a theological problem. It's not a problem of a literary problem in terms of a literary understanding. It's plain that Satan is a ridiculous figure. He just doesn't sound like a ridiculous figure. So he uses persuasive language, and he always avoids the question of whether it's right or wrong. Note that for yourselves. And that's because the issue is so cut and dry. There's no evasion around it. If you're opposed to God, then you're in the wrong. Whatever your perceived grievance is, if God is good and holy and just and faithful, then to oppose him is to be in the wrong. It's the end of the story. Satan doesn't want to talk about that. So he has chosen to make himself a sort of anti-God figure. His first speech is rhetorically impressive. He claims the ownership of hell. He's been cast down to hell. You can't claim to be the owner when you're thrown in prison. Okay, I own this place. Oh, okay, if you want to say so. You would never have chosen this place. You've been thrown there. Okay, I'm your new possessor. Hail. Reflecting to some degree the writings of Hesiod, by the way, in the golden age of humanity, all things were held in common. And now he says, well, now we don't have to share this with anyone. We all have this equally. And so he declares a sort of democracy. We're all in this together. This is great. And then the first thing he does is try and deceive his fellow devils into getting them to do what he has already decided he wants to do. And he does. He tricks and manipulates them. He lies. And he is going to be the sole ruler in hell. At least so he thinks. He's going to find when he rises up in Book 2 to the gates of hell that he's not even the top dog in hell. He can't get out. And death is, in fact, his master, which shocks him to no end and outrages him. That such an ugly phantasm should be his master. But so it is, ordained by God. But in the Greek rendition, as I say, presented by Hesiod, in the golden age of humanity, all things were held in common. And then there's a rebellion against Saturn, led by Jupiter. And as time passes, individuals claimed ownership of things individually. Private property was hell. This is a consequence of the fall from the Golden Age. So there's an appeal to restore a sort of democracy where all things are shared in common, like the Acts 2 type understanding we often read about. It was Acts 2, it's Acts 4. All things are shared in common, remind me. Totally drawn a blank there. But you know, the early church, they shared everything together. So it was only in one church, by the way, in Jerusalem. And I think it's because Jesus said that Jerusalem was going to be leveled to the ground. What's the point in holding on to private property if the place that you're standing on is going to be destroyed? There is no point. We don't see that what happened in the Jerusalem church being repeated elsewhere. In fact, Paul has to go around the churches in Asia Minor, Turkey, etc., asking for them to give money to the saints in Jerusalem because they've sold all their property. So if you're thinking that the Christianity is a pretext for communism, I think you ought to be disabused of that just simply by that illustration. Anyway, that's a little off topic, but there's a reference to this change of his mind. It's something that he subjected himself to himself. The mind is its own place, he says, as if he had control over his own thoughts. But we've already seen, or we will see, even in heaven, when he first thinks rebellious thoughts against God, he can't hide it. Sin pops out of his head. Everyone can see it. It's impossible to hide things from God. Satan claims that he has mastery over his own mind. He does not. The reason people buy Satan's argument is because they think that their thoughts are hidden to God, which they're not. The Lord looks upon the heart. Right? Our inmost being, he sees our thoughts from afar. Same with Satan. God doesn't have to wait for things to transpire. Remember, God is outside of time. He sees the past, the present, the future. He looks within our souls, sees our hearts. There's nothing hidden from him that we have done or are doing or will do. It's all plain to him. So when Satan claims that the mind is its own place and can make a heaven of hell a hell of heaven, it's an absurd claim. And to some degree, and this is what I want to conclude with, it's an interesting thought. It is the inversion of heaven. He is a sort of a negative reflection of God, bound to total opposition. And he says, if I still be the same, is one of his lines. But the fact is that he's changing constantly and has no control over himself. Even when he tries to leave the floor of hell and work his way up towards the gates of hell, he can't. He's reeling like the town drunk from side to side. He's all over the place. He can't even control his own flight. But and when he asserts his freedom, he is in fact asserting his tyranny. And Satan becomes a sort of an anti-God figure, but by negation. So he's the absence of everything good. Do not ontologize it. Don't make this mistake. He is not an entity that is evil. He is the privation of the good. Read what C.S. Lewis writes about Milton's Augustinian theology. I think it's very important here. When Satan opposes God, he loses something of himself, and he represents the absence of God, not a force that opposes him. If otherwise, there is a dualism here. He opposes God's will and his being, and thereby loses his own. And therefore, hell is also portrayed in similarly Augustinian terms. So again, the landscape, he says there's no light, but rather darkness visible. The privation of light. one of the descriptors. We'll find this is characteristic of Milton's description here. And the reason there can be no freedom in hell is because freedom is an intrinsic part of God's eternal being, because God is love. And so the free submission, the free act of adoring, which God himself enjoys in his own being before the creation of anything, this is one of the ridiculous claims, is that God, that Satan will make this claim later on, is that God created us so that he would be worshipped. He needs our worship. What would he do without us? This totally misrepresents the truth, because God, there's, I don't know if you've done this in your theology classes. If not, you should. There's a difference between the ontological Trinity and the economic Trinity. Have you done this in your theology classes? So in the ontological Trinity, this is God, how he acts within his own nature. The Father loves the Son loves the Father, the Holy Spirit loves the Father and the Son, etc. So God is triune love. He existed before anything was created. He's eternal. Always loved. So that love relationship, and there's nothing lacking in that love relationship. Out of grace, he decides he will create. And he creates man in his own image out of love. So the economic Trinity relates, the three persons of the Godhead relate to other things outside of themselves. And that's how we experience it. The Son loves us so much he died for us. But it's not because he lacked love. So when Satan acts against God, he contradicts what love is. He experienced nothing but love from God. He never had anything but love from God. He repaid that love with the choice not to love, to reject that love. And the consequence of this is he also lost freedom, because freedom and love go together. God wants all of his beings to love him freely, and he gives them the choice not to love him, demonstrating the freedom of it. This will be, we'll see when we come to Book 3, this is a really important part of Milton's understanding, and how important freedom is, which he also speaks of in Areopagitica. Let's not compel, because that will undermine all our efforts. By all means, if something is blasphemous, it's been published and printed, we can censor it then, but don't impede freedom, because that is the means by which God's truth works and by which love works. And so freedom is an intrinsic part of God's eternal being, and service, and here there's a little bit of a paradox here, but not really, when you understand that to love God is to be free. If the Son sets you free, you are free indeed, says Paul. We will speak of loving God also in terms of service, and the service is freedom. So we are free when we love God. We're freed from what? We're freed from sin. We're freed from self-absorption. We're free from the tendency we have to love something other than God, which the Bible calls idolatry, which we can see illustrated in slavery. When we love something other than God, we become slaves. And will hate freedom. So service of God is freedom. Whereas the service of our own wants and desires is a diabolical form of slavery. Diabolical because it is deceitful. If you think freedom means I can do whatever I want, and that's freedom, this is totally delusional. If we're created by God, for God, then to deny God and seek to have our own way rather than his way is to reject all relationship to him. And that's what slavery is. Comments or questions? I wanted to make that sort of summary statement because it's very easy, and this is part of the strength of Paradise Lost, is the devil is very persuasive. Unless you recognize Milton's portrait of him is not trying to deviate from orthodoxy one bit. We are not supposed to be persuaded by the devil and his arguments. There is no possible alliance there between us and the devil. He is our enemy. The fact that it has an appeal suggests that we haven't thought enough about it, and maybe our hearts are not sufficiently attuned to God and his grace. But Milton means to portray the devil in a very orthodox fashion. I have no doubt about that. And he'll make it plain in some of his description as well. So now one of the things he does in Book 2 is that there is a consult in hell. There's a sort of a committee. My old friend and former pastor said that one of the marks of hell is that there are lots of committee meetings. That never went over very well in the committee meetings that he was presiding over, right? And there is a sort of a parallelism here, because of course in Book 3 there will be also a dialogue in heaven. Note, it's not a consultation, but there's a sort of a gathering together of all the fallen angels and a discussion in hell. Now, the Council of Heaven is an epic convention. There is no Council of Hell in previous epics. This is new. At least I can't think of a precedent for that. The Greek and Roman epics portray the underworld as a shadowy place where you lose the essence of your being. It's a place you never want to be. Even Achilles says that, who willingly chose to go down to the underworld early and live a life of eternal fame. Everyone speaks the name of Achilles and what a great hero he was. Achilles in Homer's Underworld says, "Don't you talk to me about what a hero I am, Odysseus. I would rather live anonymously as a farmer to a ripe old age than come down here one day earlier than I've had to." So that's his experience speaking in the underworld. That's Achilles, the great Achilles, the epic hero of the Iliad. So it's a place you don't want to be, and it's unambiguous. All of the epics of the ancient world, you are going to the underworld. That's where you're going to end up, but you don't want to go there. And they are called shades. At least that's the English translation. They're just pale shadows of their former selves. They can't even speak, actually, until they get a little drink of blood, and then they can talk. It's a little grisly. But they are going there invariably. So there's no consultation in hell. They can't talk. They just sort of hang around like leaves fallen from a tree in great heaps. And in the Virgil's Roman epic, there is a little bit of a dichotomy. The bad characters are sent to Tantalus, a place of torment where monstrous shapes reside, and the good characters are sent to the Elysian fields, but it's still in the underworld. And they're not particularly thrilled to be there, but at least it's better than being punished. So there's no consultation in that as a precedent. It's also not there in Dante. There is no consult in hell. So Milton puts it there, and he puts it there to present something. First of all, there's a dramatic power to doing so. And also, but there is something of the two sides, the discussions between the parliamentarian army on the one hand and the royalist army on the other. But more than anything, I think it just gives us a portrait of the absurdity of opposing God. All the counsels of the wicked are just totally fruitless. And it's also a total fraud anyway. Satan's plan, which he announces at the outset, is to do so by deceit. We'll go back, and this time we won't do a full frontal assault. We'll do it subtly by means of deceit. And then he and Beelzebub have a discussion with the group, and they manufacture consent to do what Satan's already decided to do, which is to go and pervert mankind. It was already decided. You ever been in a meeting like that when the chair of the board has decided what's going to happen? Let's have a big discussion. I really want to know what you people think about it. And then they talk and they talk and they talk. And then we find a way of orchestrating the outcome so that the person who's chairing the committee gets what he wants, and he does it every time. Satan, that is a satanic figure. Not talking about your board meetings, although it might be true of your board meetings. It's true of some of my board meetings where that's happened, but probably overstates it a little bit. But I like irony. So there is a consultation here, which is not really a consultation. It's as I say, an attempt to manufacture consent, and for Satan to be flattered by his peers. What a hero you are, Satan. But let me pick this up in Book 2. Again, we're given the argument at the outset. But the first few lines are very interesting. So, high on a throne of royal state. So he's asserted their equal state in the underworld, in hell, and yet he's seated on a throne as if he were the monarch. Yes?
So is it like Satan wants to be praised by these other demons, but then he accuses God of only making humans because he wants to be praised?
He accuses God of tyranny when God not only wants free worship, he allows people to dissent from him, whereas Satan allows no dissent, and he is the tyrant, because the tyrant is the one that robs you of all freedom, and there is no freedom in hell. Satan epitomizes it, and even where he thinks he's acting freely by opposing God, it's clear that God has allowed him to do this, and he's actually serving God's purposes. And he acknowledges that as well. Well, I might succeed, and then he'll seek to try and overturn that, and then we'll do it again. Well, how is that even possible? It's not possible. It's ridiculous. The reason we don't follow the argument entirely, or there's a little bit of a hesitation, is that, yeah, but mankind falls. So, does he not succeed a little bit? And did God not want that to happen, since he permitted it and saw the outcome of it? Is God not the architect of the fall of mankind then? Does that not then make God, if not evil, then complicit in the act of evil? Those are the questions that will arise in Book 3. These are theological problems that perhaps some of you have, I don't know. But note how he's portrayed at the outset of Book 2, high on a throne of royal state, which far outshone the wealth of Ormus and of Ind. Or where the gorgeous East with richest hand showers on her kings barbaric pearl and gold. Ostentatious. Satan exalted sat, by merit raised to that bad eminence. And from despair, thus high uplifted beyond hope, aspires beyond thus high, insatiate to pursue vain war with heaven, and by success untaught, his proud imaginations thus displayed. Now, just look at the language here. He has been raised by despair beyond hope. What does that mean? Hope lifts you as high as you can be lifted. because hope is in God. He has no hope in God. So he is, as I said last time, sparrow is the Latin word for hope. He is in despair. He has no hope. In what sense is he lifted above that? None that makes any sense. He is the foil for God henceforward. He is God's drudge. He will serve God's bidding. High uplifted beyond hope, aspires beyond thus high. Insatiate to pursue vain war with heaven. It's vain because it flatters his vanity, and it's vain because it's impossible. The success is impossible. So there's a double meaning. There are lots of double meanings in Milton's language, by the way. And then he speaks. Powers and dominions, deities of heaven, for since no deep within her gulf can hold immortal vigor, though oppressed and fallen, I give not heaven for lost. From this descent celestial virtues rising will appear more glorious and more dread than from no fall, and trust themselves to fear no second fate. Me, though just right, and the fixed laws of heaven did first create your leader, next, free choice, with what besides in council or in fight, hath been achieved of merit. Yet this loss thus far at least recovered, hath much more established in a safe, unenvied throne, yielded with full consent. So he threw us down here, and now hell has very happily put me on the throne, consented to my monarchy. Like, there's just regular delusional, narcissistic pronouncements. But they sound good. We haven't really fallen that far. Our celestial virtues are unimpeded. Note the celestial is heavenly. But he's in hell, so how are they celestial? It's a misnomer now. The happier state in heaven, which follows dignity, might draw envy from each inferior. But who here will envy, whom the highest place exposes foremost to stand against the thunderer's aim? Your bulwark, and condemns to greatest share of endless pain, where there is then no good for which to strive. No strife can grow up there from faction, for none sure will claim in hell precedence, none whose portion is so small of present pain that with ambitious mind will covet more. We've got nothing to lose. Nobody's going to envy us. So because he's taken absolutely everything away from us, we're in a great position. He can't take anything away because we have nothing. This is great. Now we can advance to greater things. With this advantage then, to union and firm faith and firm accord, more than can be in heaven, we now return to claim our just inheritance of old, surer to prosper than prosperity could have assured us. If you spot the contradictions all over the place, that's because Milton means you to. We have a surer route to prosperity than prosperity could have assured us, because you can lose prosperity. Here we have nothing. So we're in a wonderful position. It's like selling a swampland in Florida. It's great. And by that best way, whether of open war or covert guile, we now debate. Who can advise may speak. He ceased, and next him Moloch, sceptered king, stood up, the strongest and the fiercest spirit that fought in heaven, now fiercer by despair. His trust was with the eternal, to be deemed equal in strength, and rather than be less, cared not to be at all, and with that care lost when all his fear of God or hell or worse he reckoned not, and these words thereafter spake. So Moloch, the god on whose bronze hands babies were sacrificed, who sees himself in defiance equal to God, and yet is dedicated, because he cares nothing, is dedicated to annihilation, to literal non-being. In some sense, then the worst. My sentence is for open war. Let's have Adam again. Implacable hatred towards God. So we fought him once with arms. Let's go once more into the breach, dear friends. Of wiles, more unexpert, I boast not. Let those contrive who need, or when they need, not now. For while they sit contriving, shall the rest, millions that stand in arms and longing wait the signal to ascend, sit lingering here, heaven's fugitives, and for their dwelling place accept this dark, opprobrious den of shame, the prison of this tyranny who reigns. Who reigns by our delay? No, let us rather choose armed with hell, flames, and fury all at once, or heaven's high towers to force resistless way, turning our tortures into horrid arms. Against the torturer, when to meet the noise of his almighty engine he shall hear infernal thunder, and for lightning see black fire and horror shot with equal rage among his angels, and his throne itself mixed with Tartarian sulfur and strange fire, his own invented torments. So there's Moloch. Let's have open war. He ended frowning, Milton writes, 106, and his look denounced desperate revenge. And battle dangerous to less than gods. On the other side, uprose Belial. In act, more graceful and humane. A fairer person lost not heaven. Remember, Milton described Belial in Book 1 as being the most subtle of all the enemies of God, often presented in clerical guise, smooth, unctuous, noble in gesture, speaks in all the right language, knows the best people, but perverts true religion. Milton's absolutely castigating of these figures. Remember, he did it in Lycidas as well. But he's far more graceful and humane. In fact, a fair person lost not heaven. So he seemed for dignity composed and high exploit. But all was false and hollow, says Milton. Though his tongue dropped manna and could make the worse appear the better reason, to perplex and dash maturest counsels, for his thoughts were low, to vice industrious, but to nobler deeds timorous and slothful. For his thoughts, yet he pleased the ear, and with persuasive accent thus began. So he is, in terms of the demonic counsel, he is the antithesis to Moloch. Moloch is full frontal rage. Belial, when he rises up, is the exact opposite. Persuasive, urbane, likable, winsome. I should be much for open war, O peers. He calls them his peers. Sounds like an aristocrat. Milton will have heard this many times. As not behind in hate, if what was urged, main reason to persuade immediate war, did not dissuade me most, and seemed to cast ominous conjecture on the whole success. When he who most excels in fact of arms, in what he counsels and in what excels, mistrustful, grounds his courage on despair and utter dissolution, as the scope of all his aim, after some dire revenge, referring to Moloch. First, what revenge? The towers of heaven are filled with armed watch, that render all access impregnable. Oft on the bordering deep encamp their legions, or with obscure wing scout far and wide into the realms of night, scorning surprise. Or could we break our way by force, and at our heels all hell should rise with blackest insurrection to confound heaven's purest light, yet our great enemy, all incorruptible, would on his throne sit unpolluted, and the ethereal mold, incapable of stain, would soon expel her mischief, and purge off the baser fire victorious. Open war is impossible. Thus repulse, our final hope is flat despair. We must exasperate the almighty victor to spend all his rage. And that must end us. That must be our cure, to be no more. Sad cure. For who would loose, though full of pain, this intellectual being? He wants to be annihilated also. Both of them want annihilation. The one thinks that victory is possible, the other knows it's impossible. But let's do it so that he will finish us off, so we will no longer. It is a sad cure. For who would loose those thoughts that wander through eternity? This intellect, though full of pain, this intellectual being. So what remains in them of their reason? They can discuss and talk and so forth, and they will lose all of that. Attributes by the way of the fact that God made them angels. They have this capacity, and he wants to lose even that. But who would do this? Those thoughts that wander through eternity to perish, rather swallowed up and lost in the wide womb of uncreated night, devoid of sense and motion. And who knows? Let this be good, whether our angry foe can give it, or will ever. Maybe he will keep us in conscious torment forever. How he can is doubtful. That he never will is sure. Will he, so wise, let loose at once his ire, be like through impotence or unaware to give his enemies their wish, and end them in his anger, whom his anger saves to punish endless? This is their only hope. This is the demonic hope, that they will be utterly annihilated. They will lose their being, not be in conscious torment eternally. That's not God's plan for them. No, Milton's already addressing views of hell that have been addressed in the 20th century, for that matter, actually. Wherefore cease we then? Say they who counsel war, we are decreed, reserved and destined to eternal woe. Whatever doing, what can we suffer more? What can we suffer worse? Is this then worst, thus sitting, thus consulting, thus in arms? What when we fled amain, pursued and struck with heaven's afflicting thunder, and besought the deep to shelter us? This hell then seemed a refuge from those wounds, or when we lay chained on the burning lake. That sure was worse. What if the breath that kindled those grim fires, awaked, should blow them into sevenfold rage and plunge us in the flames? Or from above should intermitted vengeance arm again his red right hand to plague us? What if all her stores were open, and this firmament of hell should spout her cataracts of fire? Impendent horrors, threatening hideous fall one day upon our heads. While we, perhaps, designing or exhorting glorious war, caught in a fiery tempest, shall be hurled, each on his rock transfixed, the sport and prey of racking whirlwinds, or forever sunk under yon boiling ocean, wrapped in chains, there to converse with everlasting groans, unrespited, unpitied, unreprieved, ages of hopeless end. This would be worse. War, therefore, open or concealed alike, my voice dissuades. For what can force or guile with him, or who deceive his mind, whose eye views all things at one view? Remember, he knows that God is outside space and time, that he's omniscient. There's no point in a war. He from heaven's height All these are motions vain, seas and rides. No, not more almighty to resist our might than wise to frustrate all our plans and wiles. Shall we then live thus vile, the race of heaven thus trampled, thus expelled to suffer here chains and these torments? So never mind open war, that's impossible. Shall we then just sit here in chains and torments? Better these than worse, by my advice, since fate inevitable subdues us. An omnipotent degree, the victor's will, to suffer as to do. Our strength is equal, nor the law unjust that so ordains. This was at first resolved, if we were wise against so great a foe, contending and so doubtful that might fall. I laugh when those who at the spear are bold and venturous, if that fail them, shrink in fear, what yet they know must follow to endure exile or ignominy and pain, the sentence of their conqueror. This is now our doom, which if we can sustain and bear, our supreme foe in time may much remit his anger. So if we just sit here and do nothing, maybe he'll give us a sort of reward for good behavior. Maybe not a get out of jail card, but the flames will maybe burn a little less hot. Perhaps thus far removed, not mind us not offending, satisfied with what is punished. Thus Belial, and then Mammon speaks. What does Mammon say? Let's go up to heaven, because there's lots of gold there, and good stuff there, and we can dig into it. And in fact, there's gold in the earth. Let's go and plunder the riches. That's great. So we're not going to pursue by force impossible, 250. But let's go up there and see, 270, whether we can imitate his light. Heaven's a place of light. Let's go after something that looks a lot like light. This desert soil wants not her hidden luster. So let's mine the pits of hell. Gems and gold, nor want we skill or art from whence to raise magnificence. And what can heaven show more? Our torments also may in length of time become our elements. These piercing fires as soft as now severe, our temper change. So so let's stick down here and we'll have a mining company in hell. We'll dig up the soil and maybe there's some shiny things there and it'll make this place light. And you know what? With a little panache, a little bit of decorative verve, this place will be the bespoke place to be. You know, it's like my trendy, it's my best. Total failure. He scarce had finished when such murmur filled the assembly as when hollow rocks retain the sound of blustering winds, which all night long had roused the sea. Now with hoarse cadence lull seafaring men o'erwatched, whose bark by chance or pinnacle anchors in a craggy bay after the tempest. Such applause was heard as Mammon ended, and his sentence pleased, advising peace. For such another field they dreaded worse than hell. So much the fear of thunder and the sword of Michael wrought still exists within them. Which when Beelzebub perceived, than whom Satan except none higher sat, with grave aspect he rose, and in his rising seemed a pillar of state. So now Beelzebub comes forward, and Beelzebub, of course, is the inner confidant of Satan. And now he is going to speak the speech that Satan himself supports and has already articulated. But he seems a pillar of state. Deep on his front engraven deliberation sat in public care, and princely counsel in his face yet shone, majestic though in ruin. Sage he stood with Atlantean shoulders, fit to bear the weight of mightiest monarchies. His look drew audience and attention still, as night or summer's noontide air, while thus he spake. thrones and imperious powers, offspring of heaven, ethereal virtues. Or these titles now must we renounce, and changing style be called princes of hell? For so the popular vote inclines here to continue, and build up here a growing empire. Doubtless, while we dream, and know not that the King of heaven hath doomed this place our dungeon, not our safe retreat beyond his potent arm, to live exempt from heaven's high jurisdiction, in new league banded against his throne, but to remain in strictest bondage, though thus far removed, under the inevitable curb reserved his captive multitude. For he, be sure, in height or depth, still first and last will reign sole king, and of his kingdom loose no part by our revolt. But over hell extend his empire, and with iron scepter rule us here, as with his golden those in heaven. What sit we then projecting peace and war? War hath determined us, and foiled with loss irreparable. Terms of peace, yet none vouchsafed or sought. For what peace will be given to us enslaved? But custody severe, and stripes and arbitrary punishment inflicted. And what peace can we return, but to our power, hostility, and hate, untamed reluctance, and revenge though slow, yet ever plotting how the conqueror least may reap his conquest, and may least rejoice in doing what we most in suffering feel. So this is it. This is the only path. Revenge. Nor will occasion want, nor shall we need with dangerous expedition to invade heaven, whose high walls fear no assault or siege, or ambush from the deep. What if we find some easier enterprise? There is a place, if ancient and prophetic fame in heaven err not, another world, the happy seat of some new race called man, about this time to be created like to us, though less in power and excellence, but favored more of him who rules above. So was his will pronounced among the gods, and by an oath that shook heaven's whole circumference confirmed. Thither let us bend all our thoughts, to learn what creatures there inhabit, of what mold or substance, how endued, and what their power, and where their weakness, how attempted best by force or subtlety. Though heaven be shut, and heaven's high arbitrator sits secure in his own strength, this place may lie exposed, the utmost border of his kingdom, left to their defense who hold it. So let's go there then. 378. Thus Beelzebub pleaded his devilish counsel, first devised by Satan. So he's the mouthpiece of Satan here. First deceived, first devised by Satan, and in part proposed. For whence, but from the author of all ill, could spring so deep a malice? So to confound the race of mankind in one root, and and earth with hell to mingle and involve, done all to spite the great Creator, but their spite still serves his glory to augment. This is Milton's comment. It's a theological comment. The bold design pleased highly those infernal states, and joy sparkled in all their eyes. With full assent they vote, whereat his speech he thus renews. Well have ye judged, well ended long debate, synod of gods, and like to what ye are. Synod is an assembly of Presbyterian elders, or a council of Anglican divines. So there, again, the comparison with rotten clergy, Milton continues. And like to what ye are, great things resolved, from which from the lowest deep will lift us once more lift us up in spite of fate. Note that it repeatedly refers to fate, as if God himself were under the conditions of the pagan world, whereby the gods were themselves subjected to fate and had no power to change it. He will repeatedly refer to fate in this way. Again, this is a pagan concept. It's not a Christian one. Fate is unchangeable. fate is something you can't bargain with. There's no freedom possible with fate. Even the gods can't change fate. The Greek and Roman gods, they look at what is fated, and it is Zeus's job to bring it about, but nobody can change it. And the suggestion by Satan here is that that God, the God, is subjected to is under the same conditions, which is itself absurd. And Milton would recognize the absurdity. But in spite of fate, we will be lifted nearer our ancient seat, perhaps in view of those bright confines, whence with neighboring arms and opportune excursion we may chance re-enter heaven, or else in some mild zone dwell not unvisited, of heaven's fair light secure, and at the brightening orient beam purge off this gloom, the soft delicious air, to heal the scar of those corrosive fires, shall breathe her balm. And so then the question is, and he concludes his speech with this, 4:12, here we had need all circumspection, and we now no less choice in our suffrage, for on whom we send the weight of all, and our last hope relies. Sorry, the question was just before this, 4:02. First, whom shall we send in search of this new world? Whom shall we find sufficient? Who shall tempt with wandering feet the dark, unbottomed, infinite abyss, and through the palpable obscure find out his uncouth way? So who's going to go? Great, we're going to go deceive mankind. Which one of us is going to go? Note here that there's a parallelism between here and what we'll read in Book 3. The Father proclaims that mankind will receive grace. And then he asks, through atoning for mankind's sin, who's going to do this? God the Father asks. Silence. Crickets. No crickets in heaven, but there's nothing. Nobody answers. Echoes this passage here. I guess it's the other way around. But this said, Satan sat, and expectation held his look suspense, awaiting who appeared to second, or oppose, or undertake the perilous attempt, but all sat mute, pondering the danger with deep thoughts, and each in others' countenance read his own dismay, astonished. None among the choice and prime of those heaven-warring champions could be found so hardy as to proffer or accept alone the dreadful voyage. So at last Satan, whom now transcendent glory raised above his fellows, with monarchal pride conscious of highest worth, unmoved thus spake. O progeny of heaven, imperial thrones, with reason hath deep silence and demur seized us, though undismayed. Long is the way, and hard, and out of hell leads up to light. Our prison strong, this huge convex of fire outrageous to devour, immures us round ninefold, and gates of burning adamant, barred over us, prohibit all egress. These past, if any pass, the void profound of unessential night receives him next, wide gaping, and with utter loss of being threatens him, plunged in the abortive gulf. And if thence he scape into whatever world or unknown region, what remains him less than unknown dangers and as hard escape? But I should ill become this throne, O peers, and this imperial sovereignty, adorned with splendor, armed with power, if aught proposed and judged of public moment in the shape of difficulty or danger could deter me from attempting. I would not be worthy of this throne on which I've been placed if I would not do this for you. Wherefore do I assume these royalties and not refuse to reign, refusing to accept as great a share of hazard as of honor alike due to him who reigns, and so much to him due of hazard more, as he above the rest high honored sits. Go therefore, mighty powers, terror of heaven though fallen, intend at home, while I go up and do this. So off he goes, and there's a thundering applause. and they bend with awful reverence prone. So they won't worship God, but they're going to bow down before Satan, 477. And as a God, extol him equal to the highest in heaven. They won't submit to God and show him reverence, but they will bow down to Satan. Milton's comment here. Oh, shame to men. 496. Devil with devil damned firm concord holds. Men only disagree of creatures rational, though under hope of heavenly grace and God proclaiming peace, yet live in hatred, enmity, and strife among themselves, and levy cruel wars, wasting the earth, each other to destroy, as if, which might induce us to accord, man had not hellish foes enough besides, that day and night for his destruction wait. So his comment is that devil to devil are in firm concord without disagreement. And disagreement is the actual gift of heaven. Rational dissent. Choice. They act as one. The Stygian council thus dissolved, forth they go up. Okay, so Satan now goes up. Let me skip over. I may not get through the entirety of book 2, but I'll see how far I can. Pick it up at line 629. He's winged his way upwards, as I say, up, and he's bouncing around the sides of hell. Meanwhile, the adversary of God and man, by God already assured, by man was just resolved, Satan, with thoughts inflamed of highest design, puts on swift wings and towards the gates of hell explores his solitary flight. Sometimes he scours the right-hand coast, sometimes the left. Now shaves with level wing the deep. So he's going side to side and up and down. He has no control over his own body, even in hell. Then soars up to the fiery concave, touring high, as when far off at sea a fleet descried hangs in the clouds by equinoctial winds close sailing from Bengala or the isles of Ternate and Tidore, whence merchants bring their spicy drugs. So Satan's compared to a drug merchant. So seemed far off the flying fiend. At last appear hell bounds high reaching to the horrid roof. And thrice threefold the gates. Three folds were brass, 3 iron, 3 of adamantine rock, impenetrable, impaled with circling fire, yet unconsumed. Before the gates there sat, on either side, a formidable shape. The one seemed woman to the waist and fair, but ended foul in many a scaly fold, voluminous and vast, a serpent armed with mortal sting. About her middle round a cry of hellhounds, never ceasing, barked with wide Cerberian mouths, full loud, and rung a hideous peal. Yet when they list, would creep, that is, when they heard anything, they would creep, if aught disturbed their noise, into her womb, and kennel there. Yet there still barked and howled, within unseen. Far less abhorred than these, vexed Scylla. Now he's going to make the comparison. He's describing something that no man has ever seen. The worst creatures in the Odyssey and in the Aeneid, for that matter, were Scylla and Charybdis. But this sight is far worse. Again, the epic use of the classical allusions are there to amplify how great, and in this case, how terrible hell is. It's far worse and far less abhorred than these, vexed Scylla bathing in the sea that parts Calabria from the hoarse Trinacrian shore. It's on the west coast, southwest coast of Italy. Nor uglier follow the night hag. When called in secret, riding through the air, she comes lured with the smell of infant blood. British mythology, or rather Norse. to dance with Lapland witches. Maybe think of Macbeth even here. While the laboring moon eclipses at their charms. Now line 666. The other shape. This is the famous line. The other shape. If shape, it might be called that shape had none distinguishable in member, joint, or limb. Or substance might be called that shadow seemed. For each seemed either. Black it stood as night, fierce as 10 furies, terrible as hell, and shook a dreadful dart. What seemed his head, the likeness of a kingly crown had on. Satan was now at hand, and from his seat the monster moving onward came as fast with horrid strides. Hell trembled as he strode. The undaunted fiend, what this might be, admired, not feared, God and his Son except, created thing not valued he nor shunned, and with disdainful look thus first began. Satan, whence and what art thou, execrable shape, that darest, though grim and terrible, advance thy miscreated front athwart my way to yonder gates? Through them I mean to pass, that be assured, without leave asked of thee. Retire or taste thy folly, and learn by proof, hell-born not to contend with spirits of heaven. To whom the goblin, full of wrath, replied, Art thou that traitor angel? Art thou he who first broke peace in heaven and faith, till then unbroken, and in proud rebellious arms drew after him the third part of heaven's sons, conjured against the highest? For which both thou and they, outcast from God, are here condemned to waste eternal days in woe and pain? And reckons thou thyself with spirits of heaven, hell-doomed, and breathes defiance here and scorn where I reign king, and to enrage thee more, thy king and lord? Back to thy punishment, false fugitive, and to thy speed add wings, lest with a whip of scorpions I pursue thy lingering, or with one stroke of this dart strange horror seize thee, and pangs unfelt before. So spake the grisly terror, and in shape so speaking and so threatening grew tenfold more dreadful and deformed. On the other side, incensed with indignation, Satan stood unterrified, and like a comet burned that fires the length of Ophiuchus huge in the Arctic sky, and from his horrid hair shakes pestilence and war. Let me stop there. Comments here. So here we are going to meet, and I'll anticipate, but you already know, here we're going to meet, and it's a lovely family reunion. Sin and death. Satan will reunite with sin and death. As a family reunion. But he doesn't recognize them. Remarkable parody here of the account of, we're going to read in a second, the creation of Eve, and also that of Athena. Comes from his side, just like Eve comes out of Adam's side. On the other hand, it comes from his head. The rebellious thought springs out of Satan's head, does sin. And the hellhounds arise out of this. But he has no idea who this is. But note the description here. The other shape, if shape had none, it might be called that shape had none distinguishable in member, joint, or limb of substance might be called that shadow seemed. The portrait here is, this language here is throughout the 18th century used to illustrate the sublime, which is a literary category. This is just sort of off topic to some degree, but this Paradise Lost is famous in the 19th century. The Romantics make it so. But even in the 18th century, when there are aesthetic treatises being written, this is the foremost instance used to illustrate the literary sublime. Something that defies our capacity to articulate. And death is that figure. Notes that he is light. He is a shape, if you can call it a shape when it has no shape, or substance, you might call it, that it seems like a shadow. Tolkien will pick this up in The Lord of the Rings, describe the nine riders as well, a notion of shadow. There's something of the non-being or the privation of the good going on here. A shadow is something that's cast by the light. It doesn't exist on its own, though. You need something to be present for a shadow to exist. Shadows aren't without something that casts them. They're also not possible without a light. So it's the expression of something that is sort of non-existent. It brings others to non-existence as well, in one sense. What is death? It's a metaphysical thing, a very hard thing to describe. Milton's amplifying James, by the way, here. James 1:17? Not sure the exact verse, but there or thereabouts. It talks about the after death, death proceeds from sin. After a time, after it's become pregnant with it and so forth. So Milton's amplifying it, and he is creating these figures, metaphysical figures, almost like actors on the stage of history. And I don't know of a precedent for it. Dante has Lucifer down in the Inferno at the bottom of it. And of course he brings about, and the whole of the Inferno is marked by various gradations of sin. But they're not actually presented as figures here, where they are in Milton. This is Milton's invention. So he's taking James's one line and amplifying it significantly. And I think it's very powerful for a variety of reasons, but one of them is because sin does seem like an agent, and so does death, for that matter. Often the Grim Reaper, that often seems like a personally malign thing, maybe because it's impossible for us to imagine something opposed to us that doesn't have agency. But that's the portrait of it. Where am I running? Got 1 minute more. But he has no idea who this is, and they are going to fight. And note that he is the king of heaven. He makes it, or hell rather, makes it clear that he is the monarch there, and that Satan has no power to escape it. So for all of us sitting on the throne, on the bottom of hell, he's not the monarch either. And they are basically squaring up to destroy one another when a voice comes out. The sorceress. Great deeds had been done had not the snaky sorceress that sat fast by Hell Gate 725 and kept the fatal key, because sin is the gate to hell, risen and with hideous outcry rushed between. "O Father, what intends thy hand?" she cried, "against thy only Son. What fury, O Son, possesses thee to bend that mortal dart against thy Father's head? And know'st for whom? For him who sits above and laughs the while at thee ordained his drudge to execute whate'er his wrath, which he calls justice, bids. His wrath which one day will destroy ye both." She spake, and at her words the hellish pest, death, forbore. When then these to her Satan returned, these words. "So strange thy outcry, and thy words so strange interposes, that my sudden hand prevented spares, to tell thee yet by deeds what it intends, till first I know of thee, what thing thou art, thus double formed, and why in this infernal vale first met, thou call'st me Father, and that phantasm call'st my Son. I know thee not, nor ever saw till now a sight more detestable than him and thee." To whom thus the portress of Hellgate replied, "Hast thou forgot me then?" I'll quit with that wonderful rendering of Sin's voice, and we'll pick it up next time. She's hurt.